substantially increase its domestic nuclear energy. And this is the topic. If anybody here is going to TOC, this is going to be the topic. If anybody here is going to MSTOC, it's going to be the topic. So it's a pretty important one. We'll just get into some background. There's actually a surprising amount of background for a topic that seems pretty straightforward. So, just some like basic numbers and some background on nuclear energy in the United States, because obviously this topic is talking about increasing it. Right now, it's about 19% of energy production in the United States, which is not a lot at all. Things like fossil fuels, including coal and stuff like that, are about 60% of our energy production. And the United States right now has almost 193 nuclear reactors and 54 different nuclear plants. There's some stuff about like our first and our most recent plant. I don't think those are super necessary. I think I just added those for fun. Um, and right now, 22 reactors are currently being decommissioned, which is basically means that they're being taken out of service. So it's kind of a long process in which a nuclear reactor stops like producing power anymore. And that kind of works, I guess that works more for the affirmative as uniqueness, saying that like it's pretty important to increase the investment in nuclear energy right now because a lot of plants that the United States made in like the 60s, the 70s, the 80s are now being decommissioned and aren't producing nuclear energy anymore. So nuclear energy produces approximately 775 billion kilowatt hours of power per year, and the current production is at 97 gigawatts. I'm not sure what exactly the conversion there is, but basically what you need to know is that in order for us to be carbon neutral and net zero emissions by 2050, we need about 200 gigawatts of nuclear energy, which is twice our current like capacity. And this is a capacity that we've been building up since like 1969, so for a very, very long time. So it's going to take a lot of investment and like consistent effort to get to the point of like net zero emissions. Okay, so nuclear energy, you could run into some issues with topicality because the topic itself does not say a specific kind of nuclear energy. So I'll just be going over like what nuclear energy is. Speaking more generally, it's energy released from the nucleus of a volatile element. It's usually uranium-235, which is an isotope of uranium, for power generation. And there's two main kinds. There's fission and fusion. I was never great at this during chemistry, but we'll just go over it. Fission is when the nuclei of atoms are splitting apart. It's far more common, it's far more easy to do, versus fusion is when the nuclei of atoms are fusing together. This is like a far newer technology. It's far more experimental and it's less widely used. Scientists just like recently cracked nuclear fusion in like a big way in like recent years, like 2023, I think. So, fission is way more common. It's way more like commercially viable. That's what we use to produce all of our energy. So like nuclear energy, if somebody's talking about it in the broad sense, they are probably talking about nuclear fission. And it's also the reaction that goes on in our nuclear weapons. Fusion is way more long term and it's not used commonly. Right now, it's like very much in its more research, experimental, early phases. I have a whole slide dedicated to uranium because I think it's pretty important because it's the main material that they use in nuclear energy. So it's the main import. With other forms of energy, you can basically directly import sources of energy. For example, like importing petroleum and stuff like that, or even importing or exporting coal. But with nuclear energy, it's kind of difficult to define what you are like trading, importing, and exporting. So it is uranium usually. The United States is low key like geeked right now because we import about 99% of the uranium that we use for power generation, which is not great. It puts us in a negative position because we're highly, highly, highly dependent on other countries that we import uranium from, namely Canada, Kazakhstan, Russia, Uzbekistan, and Australia. Russia is specifically an issue because in May of 2024, like former President Joe Biden, he banned importing low enriched uranium from Russia, probably due to like the conflict going on in Ukraine and like the beef that we have with Russia right now. It could be reversed in the new administration, but it's somewhat unlikely because Russia like got mad at us after that happened and they were like, we don't like you either. And they also put bans on exporting uranium to us. The reason that we import so much uranium and that we're like low-key geeked right now is because uranium requires a lot of mining and infrastructure that the United States, like, they lack infrastructure to enrich uranium, and there's not a lot of will to mine for uranium right now, given that, like, we don't have a lot of nuclear power production and that we can just, like, go to our friends and go to other countries in order to get uranium. Okay. There's a ton of different like international implications to nuclear power and stuff like that. One of them is decreased reliance on oil producers or like fluctuations in oil prices, which we'll probably get into like later. But some of the biggest oil producing countries, I wrote them down here so that I wouldn't forget them, are Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, Nigeria, and China. Probably the more important ones, like debate wise and like conflict wise, in this list are going to be, and then maybe Iran. Um, okay. And then next we have hegemony. If the United States has energy independence, that's really important to just like general world dominance, but also like military preparedness and for our economy. And also, if we have energy depend independence, it means that our adversaries like Russia, like China, don't really have a bargaining chip or something that can make us like come to the table or something that they can kind of lord over us because we're not importing so much oil from them. It's kind of still an issue with nuclear power though because we are geeked and we import a lot of our uranium. And then next we have great power competition, which is just like another form of hegemony. I just put some more specific stuff because I saw a lot of articles when I was doing research for this about how the United States like is losing the nuclear power race to Russia and China, which is kind of interesting because right now the United States is the largest producer of nuclear power in the world with about 30% of the world's production, which is huge for one country to be producing that much, like that large of a proportion. But the thing is, since about like the Reagan and Carter administrations in the United States, we have kind of stagnated in like increasing nuclear capacity and stuff like that, whereas Russia and China are like locked in. Russia is exporting like more reactors and more uranium, and they're kind of becoming more of a world power in that area. And China is planning to construct 24 new power plants by 2030, which is like a really, really big deal because the United States in decades of history of doing nuclear power only has 93 plants. So China is basically constructing about like a fourth of our capacity in 5 years, which is crazy. So that's what's going on, and that's kind of like the background on the issue. Now we're going to be getting into individual arguments. If anybody has questions about the background, feel free to ask them in the chat. But also don't ask me about any of the chemistry or the nuclear stuff. I only know what's going on at a surface level. Okay. So next we have, I'll just get into arguments for each side. I think it's somewhat equal between them. I tried to make it pretty equal between the two sides. So just for like some reference going in, if there's stars next to them, these are the arguments that I think are the most lay friendly out of like the 6 or 7 that I've shown. Obviously, any argument can be adapted to the lay, but some are way easier to do than others, and some are just a lot more intuitive, so that's what the stars mean. Okay. First we have climate. So when you increase, this is like probably the most intuitive argument on this topic. It's probably what everybody's thinking of. When you increase investment in nuclear energy, that is a shift away from fossil fuels, natural gas, fracking, all of the like possibly negative things that we use for energy. And when we're able to phase out those things and fossil fuels, it leads to a decrease in emissions, slows warming, and helps us achieve net zero by 2050, which is like we need to double our capacity for nuclear energy in order to do that. Obviously, like net zero is a super good thing. You limit emissions, you reduce the emission of gases that leads to global warming. You decrease like a major factor in climate change, which leads to natural disasters and famines and like land being uninhabitable and rising sea levels and all of that. So there's a ton of different impacts that you could read off of this. You could read air pollution impacts, you could read general climate change impacts. There is like a WHO card, like from the World Health Organization, that a lot of people read on climate change. That's like climate change kills 250,000 people every year, something like that. So you could read more general impacts about that. There's another author, Denvere, in 2021, that says that this is pretty specific to warming, but that millions of people die for every tenth of a degree of warming. So you could also read that. And then there's more nuance if you want to like add it to the argument. First is that the United States as an actor and the United States specifically investing in nuclear energy is really important because we are like the world leader, we're the world hegemon and one of the leading emitters, which means that if we decrease our reliance on fossil fuels, that kind of serves as an example to other countries and other major emitters across the globe that like it's important to decrease emissions. That's also pretty key. Like the United States needs to step up as a climate leader because in the past we've been kind of like slimed on climate action. transition. We dropped out of the Paris Agreement, which was like the biggest multilateral agreement to make clear steps towards reducing like causes of climate change. So it's kind of good if the United States steps up in this area and shows that we're committed to net zero or at least like some form of energy transition away from fossil fuels. I think the climate link is really strong and just pretty true, right? That nuclear energy decreases a lot of the negative effects of climate change. So, if you wanted to read this as a more technical argument, you could also kind of extend the impact and say that climate change leads to nuclear war through like increasing famines and like conflicts between different countries as climate change escalates. That's a pretty common card that I've seen a lot of people read. And I think that it's like relatively good on time frame because climate change is ramping up right now. Um, and then what else? Oh yeah. This kind of goes back to the first point. You could say that it's really important right now for the United States to show some kind of commitment to climate goals because after Trump was elected president, he has increased a lot of protections for like fossil fuel companies and just like major emitters in general and rolled back a lot of the climate protections that existed during the Biden era. So you could say that that actually means that it's more urgent to affirm because the United States just looks really, really bad perceptually on the climate issue right now. Next, we have energy access. I thought that this was a pretty cool argument. So it's basically saying that when you increase investment in nuclear energy, that increases like the supply of energy that the United States has and is able to produce domestically, which is a good thing because that increases access to energy for like individual households and individual families or people within the United States, which is really good because right now, high energy prices or just general divides that exist in the United States that excludes certain households from accessing energy are typically the same as like racial and class lines. Class obviously because like people that are poorer and like have lower incomes have less access, less reliable access to energy, and usually suffer the most when energy prices are spiked. But also racial lines, because a lot of the time poverty is a very racialized issue. Black and brown people in the United States are far more likely to be below the poverty line and thus lack access to like reliable access to energy and resilience when energy prices spike or fluctuate. So this argument just says that when you increase domestic production of nuclear energy, that decreases prices or at least gives households reliable access to energy and hedges against like massive price fluctuations. Like a strategic way to run this argument, I would recommend is to read it with some kind of structural violence framework or like, yeah, just a structural violence framework and reading like non-extinction impacts like intergenerational poverty or like high mortality rates in certain communities right now, or just like generally like people dying due to a lack of access to basic utilities in their homes. Next, we have AI. I don't like this argument that much. I think that AI arguments in debate are really silly because people just like copy and paste cards from logos that either like meat ride AI or like really like whatever the opposite of meat riding is for AI. And I think a lot of the links are like somewhat bad, but I'll just go over this argument because I think that it is going to be like slightly common on this topic. So it basically says that when you increase investment in nuclear energy, that means that you have more access to low cost, reliable energy, which is what like AI servers or AI data centers or like computing infrastructure requires. Like they need a lot of power and they also need a lot of water. Like AI takes a lot of water because you have to cool down the servers. But that obviously doesn't factor into this topic as much. Anyway. So, like large scale advanced AI requires a lot of power, a lot of energy in order to be run. So when you increase investment in nuclear energy, that allows more development and progression of AI, which if you're reading this on the app, you would say is a good thing. There's a bunch of impacts. Like I said, Logos just like meat rides AI a lot. Like this one says that AI solves super volcanoes, asteroids, and pandemics, and it was written in 2014, so you can feel good about that one. And it also says this one from 2021 says that AI solves extinction by like integrating it into things like military planning, environmental planning, governance, and that a lack of understanding of AI could lead us to make catastrophic choices. So, yeah. This is the AI argument. I don't like it very much, and I don't even think it's that strategic. I can get behind an argument I don't like if it's strategic, but this one, you are just like very, very open to turns because people can just spam a bunch of cards and a bunch of warrants on you right out of first constructive as to why AI is super bad, and then you have to deal with all of those, like frontline all of those, which is just not fun. I if you want, you can run it as a turn to like the neg AI argument, which means that which I think is more strategic to run any kind of AI argument as a turn rather than being the first team to bring it up. And yeah, that's basically what's going on with the AI argument. Okay, next we have econ, star next to it because I think this one is like the most intuitive besides climate. Um, Again, like all of these arguments can be run on the lay. It's just some are way easier to win than others. So the econ argument basically just says that an increase in investment revitalizes the economy. Tons of things. You create jobs through constructing new power plants. Like infrastructure specifically has like a multiplying effect by like increasing jobs, and then those people are able to spend more in the economy, stuff like that. Um, and then there's a ton of different econ links that you could read on this. This is a pretty common econ link for when like the government is investing in something. So this is a pretty good one since this topic is about the US federal government. So when the US federal government invests in something, that is a signal to private investors that it's like a safe sector or a safe market to invest in, which creates a multiplier effect where more and more people start investing in nuclear energy, which is a good thing. It creates more jobs and just generally increases the United States' GDP and capacity to create power. There's a ton of cards that say that like many investors, especially investors that are risk averse, will prefer to invest in something after the United States federal government has done so or deemed it a safe investment. Also, let's see. Yeah. Investment in general is just a good thing because it increases our GDP and also decreases our reliance on outside sources for energy. So it could decrease our oil imports, maybe even decrease our uranium imports if like someone interprets the topic as like an increase in investment in nuclear energy is also an increase in investment in like the processes associated with creating nuclear energy. So this is just an argument that it decreases our reliance and decreases our exports. And you could go for a ton of different impacts, most of which are very, very lay friendly, revitalizing the private sector, more money or attention to things like innovation, employment, increase in GDP, reduction of poverty, stuff like that. So lots of stuff on this econ argument. I think that the econ argument is pretty true as well. Okay, next we have oil. Another pretty complicated argument because there are a lot of turns on this one. I think that this one is slightly more true and more fun to read than the AI argument, but I just really don't like AI arguments, so that could just be me talking. But the oil argument basically says that when you invest in nuclear energy, that signals to major oil companies and oil producers that the green energy transition is beginning. So preemptively, in order to get rid of all of their supply of oil as quickly as possible, they massively lower oil prices, which is a good thing. Obviously, like lower oil prices is good. It increases access to electricity in poorer countries or poorer areas, even of the United States. And it's just generally good for major oil importers. It's bad for the oil exporters, though. But this argument says that low oil prices are a good thing because many oil exporters, namely Russia, I think is what like a lot of the impacts of this argument are going to be centered on. Countries that rely on oil for their economy will collapse if oil prices, or like at least significantly decline, if oil prices are lowered so quickly, which could be a good thing because it could chill like aggressive actions from them. It could decrease their willingness to engage in conflicts with larger or more economically powerful powers. Again, this argument like is pretty specific to Russia. There's a ton of different arguments read about like how Putin will react to their economy going down or to low oil prices. Some say that like the war in Ukraine would abate, whereas others would say that like he would escalate out of fear for his regime or his legitimacy. But yeah, those are like two kind of different links on why low oil prices would be a good thing. And I think that this first link, like out of this chain, I think this first link, that like major oil companies will lower their prices is probably the most true, but You could probably find a bunch of different empirics over time of like the United States increasing investment in alternative forms of energy. Maybe like when we increased I don't know, when we increased investment in like wind and solar or like REMs and renewables and see like how oil prices responded. Okay, next we have hegemony. These two arguments, hegemony and allies, are like basically the same, so I'll kind of go over them as one. But this is really similar to what I was talking about earlier about how energy security and energy independence is really, really important for hegemony and for like dominance in on the world stage because it decreases our reliance on people that we import from, it enhances our economy, and it enhances military preparedness. There's probably a ton of other different warrants. Those are the ones that I could think of off the top of my head and the ones that I've heard on like other topics where energy security and energy independence has been discussed. This argument says that maintaining US hegemony is a good thing. Again, tons of different warrants on this from like different topics, but some of the ones that I put on here was that it increases deterrence. When the United States is strong, it means that our deterrent effect and our defense in many different parts of the world is also stronger and hedges against conflicts. A good one that I can think of off the top of my head is like in Taiwan right now. It decreases deaths in war through things like deterrence mechanisms. It assures our allies and like in turn kind of as like an umbrella underneath assuring our allies, it prevents things like proliferation, right? Because if our allies sense that United States hegemony is declining or that we're no longer dominant, they will also sense that we are not going to be there for them in a conflict or that we won't adequately protect them if something bad were to happen, which could spur them to proliferate. So when the United States is strong and there's this like general aura of like military preparedness and that we will step in a conflict and that we have the resources to do so, that could hedge against the paranoia that leads to proliferation in a lot of our allies. This could also be read as a turn on the neg. There are tons of different warrants as to why US hegemony is bad. It stokes conflicts with our adversaries like Russia and China. US involvement is escalatory. The United States starts like forever wars in places like the Middle East that we just can't end. The United States has major occupations in like different countries that kill a bunch of people. There's a bunch of different warrants on either side. So as long as you understand like this basic link about energy security, you could read this on either side. You could read it as a turn, stuff like that. Um, I think that this argument is pretty good because hegemony covers so many different conflict scenarios and so many different impacts that, like, if you win the hegemony link and you win that hegemony is good, you are able to link into or prereq many different impacts on the negative side, right? Like, if the neg says that low oil prices lead to conflict, you could say that the United States, as long as United States hegemony is strong, conflict is like conflict reaches a certain threshold all the time and does not escalate beyond that. And that, like, your argument about hegemony outweighs on scope because it applies to many different conflict hotspots rather than the specific scenario the neg is talking about. So, winning hegemony and winning that hegemony is good is like broadly very strategic because you are able to take out a lot of neg impacts and read tons of turns case analysis in the back half of the round, which is really nice. Um, the allies argument is kind of just like an extension or like a subpoint of the hegemony argument. Very similar link. It's what I was talking about earlier about like energy security and how when the United States is strong, it assures our allies that we are going to be there for them in any kind of conflict. Another thing with allies is that when we have more energy security and when we increase our investment in nuclear power, it opens us up to more like energy-based trade partnerships with countries that do not have full energy security. Big one is, I'm trying to think. I was going to say no, wait, no. I can't think of examples right now. I was thinking of an example, but it was something different. Um, no, I was gonna say India. That's just wrong. India has pretty good energy security right now. But this could open us up to partnerships with countries that don't have full energy security. I'm sure you could find like different examples of them, and then it like generally assures our allies. And the good thing about allies is that you can read a ton of different like specific conflict scenarios The reason that it could be strategic to read different conflict scenarios rather than like broader arguments like hegemony, which I mentioned earlier, is that when you have specific conflict scenarios, the mechanization of your internal link is a lot better, right? You know exactly what happens, exactly who escalates, and when that escalation happens, even sometimes how it happens. And you will usually win the weighing debate on things like time frame, actor analysis, probability, stuff like that, because your conflict is far more specific to like two or three actors doing specific actions rather than like broad notions of deterrence or hegemony or like great power competition, which could be strategic. It all depends on like what your opponents are reading, how the round plays out, and like what the weighing looks like. But another reason that it's pretty strategic to read specific scenarios with specific allies is that a lot of defense I'm saying specific a lot, does not directly respond to like a very specific scenario. So you can skirt a lot of general pieces of defense or like spammed backfile responses, which is really nice. Okay, anybody have questions on the app arguments? We can also do just like broader questions at the end. Don't ask me which ally of ours doesn't have energy security, because apparently I don't know that. I was gonna say India, but I'm pretty sure they have like a pretty major pipeline. So, okay, no questions. Okay, we're moving on to the neg. Um, Again, same deal. The stars are the more lay-friendly arguments. Okay, first we have dangers. This is definitely like one of the most intuitive lay arguments on this topic. It's just like nuclear power plants are really dangerous. They have like meltdowns and also they dump a lot of radioactive waste, which is bad for the climate and bad for the environment. There's tons of different examples of major nuclear meltdowns. A lot of them are outside of the United States, but 9 Mile Point had like a pretty bad meltdown slash incident early in its I don't know, like lifetime. I feel weird saying that considering it's a power plant. But you can find a lot of different empirics of nuclear power plants being dangerous. And I think that something that's actually pretty cool to read on this argument is saying that like when you increase investment, you increase the rapid construction of different power plants, which decreases individual oversight for each of these projects, which independently makes things like accidents and meltdowns and like dangerous happenings and like non-thorough inspections a lot more likely. I think that's a pretty interesting take on this argument because I think that teams are going to have tons of responses to this idea that like nuclear power plants are dangerous, right? Like there's tons of regulations in place right now, like Chernobyl, and a lot of the other meltdowns took place decades ago, and a lot of those issues aren't a problem now. So I think that this like analysis about how when you increase investment so quickly and increase the construction of nuclear plants like within such a rapid time frame that decreases oversight and makes accidents more likely. I think that that's a pretty good like spike slash frontline to that stuff about how there's like more regulations right now. Also, if you wanted to go for this idea about radioactive waste dumping, that directly affects the climate. It contaminates water sources, stuff like that. And so that could be a link into climate, which is good because that climate is probably like the strongest AF stock contention on the lay. So it'll be good to also have like a path to that. Okay, next we have uranium mining. I think this argument is quite good. I like this argument a lot. Star next to it, it's pretty intuitive. Basically and there's a ton of different links and different ways that you could read on this, which I think is really nice. And you can vary it depending on like how tech or how flow your judges or just what argument you're comfortable with reading. But the most basic version of this argument is that increase in investment for nuclear energy means an increase in demand for uranium because nuclear energy is incredibly, incredibly dependent on uranium. That's the like crux of the operation. And so, increased demand for uranium means that we have to do more domestic uranium mining, which is bad. Uranium mining destroys the land, it contaminates water sources, it generates radioactive waste, all of that. If anybody here has ever read a turn on a rare earth minerals argument and said that like mining is bad and that mining hurts the climate, increases exposure to like diseases or something like that, this argument functions at like in a very, very similar way. Another way that you could read this argument, which I think is pretty cool and nuanced, is you could do kind of more of like an indigenous lands argument. Most of the uranium deposits in the United States, they're like near Wyoming and they're in Navajo land. So that means that if we have to mine for uranium domestically, we are likely displacing thousands of Navajos from their land, which is obviously a bad thing. Um, Land is very important to like the identity of anybody, but especially indigenous people, and the United States has a very long history of displacing indigenous people from their land, basically since like before the inception of the United States. So that is just like very bad for several reasons. Causes like intergenerational trauma and extinction of the Navajo culture, which is, not good at all. So you could read that kind of argument maybe with like an SV framework, or if you wanted to take it a step further, a framework that is specific to indigenous people or settler colonialism. I have some experience running settler colonialism, and then many people at CCA have also read like indigenous frameworks. A lot of the warrants for why you prefer impacts related to indigenous people are like ones that you have probably heard before, that they are ignored in policy making, that the trauma that they endure as a result of these kinds of actions is intergenerational and thus has basically an infinite impact, stuff like that. Another way that you could read this argument is by saying that when you increase demand for uranium, that actually increases our reliance on uranium exporters, like the ones I mentioned earlier in the slideshow, which is a bad thing and basically reverses and turns all of the energy security benefits of the AF. Because even if we have nuclear power plants or reactors or facilities, America domestically, we are not going to have like uranium enrichment facilities here, which means that even if we have the ability to make the end product, which is power, we don't have the materials to like the actual input to do that, and we still need to go to other countries, which goes against like every single energy security link on the AF, and like so many of the AF links are about energy security, like hegemony, allies, AI, energy access, obviously. Climate, no, not really climate, but yeah. It's a pretty good like turn that you could read, or like turns case analysis that you could read off of uranium mining in the back half of the round. Next, we have oil. I mentioned earlier that this could be a turn. And I kind of like previewed this argument. It's basically just saying that it's the same link from earlier. It's saying that low oil prices are a bad thing because many economies around the world, like Russia, that are extremely dependent on oil, rather than just like backing down after they lose one of their main sources of income and like one of their primary goods, they will actually lash out at other countries. Leaders like Putin are known for being like very, very erratic and lashing out when they fear for the legitimacy of their regime or the survival of their regime. So, a leader, and this scenario is very specific to Russia, but you could probably find similar scenarios for many different countries that rely on oil very heavily as a main export, like Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, stuff like that, right? I'm just doing it for Russia because that's what I think Russia probably has the most lit about this. But leaders like Putin are known to lash out economy goes down and like increase escalation or instability or like like bad things that they're doing domestically, and that's really bad. Also, if oil is so important to a country's economy that it could like that country could literally collapse if oil prices go low so quickly, like state collapse and regime collapse is obviously just a bad thing. It leads to instability. It creates awful living conditions for people that are in those countries. It leads to economic downturn and also like state collapse. A common debate argument about state collapse is that when states collapse, the resulting instability and like power vacuum opens the door for non-state actors, aka terrorist groups, to take over in the state and do things like first like commit awful atrocities against the citizens, but also do things like obtain nuclear weapons or stoke conflict in the region, which is also a bad thing. So, this is just the argument saying that low oil prices are bad for like a myriad of different reasons. Okay, next we have AI. Exactly the same link as on the AF. It's just a different impact saying that AI is bad. Um, there's a ton you just have to go on Logos and search up like artificial intelligence bad or like AI bad. That's how I found these cards. There's a ton of different warrants as to why AI is bad. Like sentient AI, AGI could lead to human extinction or endless suffering. There's like other warrants. Let's look at it. Like artificial intelligence is inherently violent. Um, AI is completely irredeemable. Let's see. Yeah, it takes away like the essential elements of being human, and it concentrates wealth and power, creates massive inequality, and it destroys dignity that gives value to human lives. So you could run something such as like an S risk on AI arguments, that like intense human suffering and constant suffering is worse than extinction. But yeah, the AI arguments in general, I just don't like very much, but I don't like debating AI that much, so that could just be me. Next year, proliferation. I don't exactly know how this argument functions, and I'm going to be completely honest about this, but it's something that like a lot of people associate with nuclear power and nuclear facilities, and obviously like the fission reaction, which is what we use to create power, like from uranium, is the same as what we do in nuclear weapons. So there's like pretty strong associations between them. It's basically just saying that increased investment in nuclear energy could be misperceived by our allies or even our adversaries and cause a cascade of proliferation out of fear that the United States is somehow like I don't even know what we would be doing because we already have nuclear weapons. That the United States is doing like sinister things behind closed doors. And I have not looked into the specifics and like the wording of the NPT, but some say that like investing in more nuclear energy and building more power plants and stuff like that could violate or like hurt the at least hurt the credibility of the NPT, which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And like very common countries in very common countries in proliferation scenarios are that like are South Korea and Japan, which are our allies, so they would be proliferating out of fear. I guess everybody proliferates out of fear, but like South Korea and Japan would be proliferating because they fear that the United States isn't going to be there for them anymore. And Iran would probably proliferate because like they're ops with us. Iran is kind of a country that's pretty erratic on proliferation. Their uranium reached like 83% purity as of April of 2024, and I think they stopped. And you need about like 85 to 90% purity for it to be weapons grade. So there's a lot of like fear about uranium, uranium enrichment, like what countries are doing with their uranium. So this is very much like a more perceptual argument about what the United States is doing with their uranium. Is it even for nuclear power, stuff like that. I thought it was that terrorists get a hold of nukes. Not the proliferation argument. Maybe like the internal link to extinction on the state collapse stuff. Yeah, it's definitely that terrorists get a hold of nukes. Not proliferation. I don't really I guess like in transportation of like nuclear infrastructure from the United States, like from other places to the United States, that could lead to terrorists getting a hold of nukes. Um, I suppose. Okay, it's common. I wasn't aware of this. Sorry, guys. Apparently, terrorists are getting a hold of nukes pretty frequently. Um, Yeah, I guess another argument off of proliferation is that like terrorists can get a hold of nukes while nuclear infrastructure is being like transported to the United States. There's a ton of impact D on like this terrorist getting a hold of nukes scenario, and it's just that like it's pretty like logistically difficult to do that because they are a non-state actor and they would need like they usually in most cases to get a hold of a nuclear weapon or to get a hold of nuclear infrastructure or to steal nuclear infrastructure. You would need to be in cahoots with an existing legitimate state, and many states like don't want to collaborate with terrorist organizations and don't want to like aid and abet them. But yeah, that I guess is also not I guess. No, that is a link off of proliferation. I don't understand or like the proliferation argument very much. I think you guys can tell. Yeah, South Korea and Japan also invest substantially in nuclear energy. And like a lot of the thing is, a lot of the uranium that countries use for nuclear energy, it is nowhere near the level of like weapons grade uranium. So weapons grade uranium is like 85 to 90% purity. I think like power grade uranium, I'm just calling it that for fun, is like 20 to 30% purity, which is completely different. So the uranium that we use in like nuclear power is easier to access, easier to enrich than weapons grade uranium. Okay. Next we have this trade-off argument. I could put a star next to this because I do think it's pretty lay friendly. I just don't know exactly how the impacts would play out. I think this is more of like an overview or an argument that you would read defensively in rebuttal versus an argument that you would read offensively in constructive or even like a turn. It's basically saying that when you increase investment in nuclear energy, that trades off with investment in innovation or just other forms of renewable energy in the United States, like wind, solar, geothermal, and hydro. Those are like the main forms that we're investing in right now, but I think all of the other ones probably just fall under this like broad innovation category, right? This is just saying that like that trade-off is a bad thing because these other forms of energy are a lot better than nuclear for like a bunch of different reasons. You could say that they are more like cost friendly, that they have fewer health and safety risks, or that they just have like a better environmental footprint or like environmental impact than nuclear energy because there are like some environmental harms associated with nuclear energy, such as like the toxic waste that comes out of nuclear plants, stuff like that. This is a pretty good argument. And I think the reason that I recommend you read it in rebuttal is that it is more general and it does not have a specific terminalized impact that you could read during constructive. It's pretty difficult to like extrapolate impacts off of a comparative, like saying that this hypothetical thing is better than this hypothetical thing. But you could read this during rebuttal and say that like this trade-off is bad because it worsens all of the things that the AF talks about, whether that is with like climate or the economy. So, I think this is better read during rebuttal because it's more all-encompassing and it's like not as good and it's far more difficult to find like a specific terminalized or quantified impact for this one. But it is pretty good to read during rebuttal. The thing is, to win trade-off, you have to win that United States investment in these other forms of energy, like substantial investment in wind or solar, geothermal, or hydro energy is likely right now, which is honestly an uphill battle considering Trump is very pro like fossil fuel, pro fracking, stuff like that. So you would have to win the uniqueness on that, which is going to be quite difficult given the current administration. But yeah, those are all of the like basic argument ideas I have. Obviously, there's a bunch of different ones, and like with these existing links, you can elaborate off of them or like do different scenarios and stuff like that. But yeah, these are all the basic arguments that I have. Um, I'm just gonna open it up. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, could defending corporations be a good neg argument? Oh my. This is long. Okay. Corporations, since they already dominate nuclear energy industry, lobby to weaken safety regulations. Really strengthens safety plus uranium mining, but with a different link story. Um, I just think that this corporations argument is like incredibly non-unique, right? And also, I think the AF wins this corporations argument because like fossil fuel companies are worse, right? And so when you increase investment in nuclear energy, I think at the end of the day, the behavior of corporations is going to be the same, regardless of what field you're in, right? They're probably going to be like equally zealous in like fossil fuels versus nuclear energy versus like even renewables, right? At that point, the behavior and the impacts after that depend on what's going on right now. The reason that fossil fuel companies have so much power is that they produce 60% of our power right now, right? Like they have a lot of sway and they have a large ability to lobby. When you do the AF, that levels the playing field. Another thing is that you have to like look at what they are defending as like corporations, right? Fossil fuels are probably worse for the environment than nuclear energy when you do the comparative at the end of the day. So, regardless of how companies behave, doing the AF is still probably a good thing because it upholds like a better form of energy and like decreases the power of fossil fuel corporations, which is like what gives their lobbying such a bad impact, right? Because if fossil fuels were like 8% of our power in the United States, nobody would care what fossil fuel corporations wanted to do, right? They wouldn't listen to lawsuits, stuff like that. They would be like, you're so expendable. Since they produce 60% of our power, we kind of have to listen to them. So when you invest in nuclear, it kind of flips the script and like I don't know. I think this argument low-key flows af, but that could just be my interpretation of it. I think an interesting way to run this argument is actually a defensive overview and rebuttal, kind of like a court clog type argument, saying that like, and I don't like court clog arguments at all when they're read as contentions because the impacts aren't real. There's like different courts for different things. Like me building a high-speed rail isn't going to affect patents. But anyway, I think reading a defensive overview in rebuttal about corporations and how even after you increase investment, fossil fuel corporations lobby against like the construction of nuclear plants, which means that even if investment goes through, none of the benefits of the AF are ever achieved. I think that's pretty strong. And it operates off of like a very similar idea of your argument, just like that corporations are going to lobby, like they're going to weaken safety regulations, stuff like that. And I think, yeah, I think that that could be interesting to read, and it like takes out all of the AF offense, and I don't think you get into like that slightly stickier debate of like what's the behavior of corporations in the AF versus the neg. What does Michi Sin think of the cancer AF? I think that it's pretty lay friendly. I think that a lot of the environmental topics that have like some kind of cancer contention or like general human health contention are pretty compelling on the lay. And I think that it is true that like, fossil fuels emissions, stuff like that, like lead to health harms like cancer. And so many lay judges, especially lay judges that are like scientists or doctors and stuff like that, are definitely going to buy this argument. Is there a good politics DA on this topic? There's a politics DA on every topic. Is it good? Basically never. Um, I think good politics DA is kind of a paradoxical phrase, but I'd say probably there is a politics DA on this topic. Let me think. Here's the thing. I don't really mess with reading politics DAs when there is not a major election coming up. Because if you don't have a major election coming up, your politics DA is just like, oh, the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling's not going to get renewed. And it's like, I don't really think that that's true at all. And I think that, like, I don't know. Politics DAs are very non-consequential when there's not a big election coming up, such as a presidential election. So I think that, yes, there probably is a politics DA on this topic. You could say that, like, I don't know. Increasing investment in nuclear energy is fractures the Republicans. Maybe like some of them are more moderate and they support nuclear energy, and some of them are just like drill baby drill. Fractures the Republicans, which makes it more difficult to pass many of the things on Trump's docket, such as like limiting birthright citizenship or H-2A visas. That's an AF argument. You would have to look into how Republicans are leaning on nuclear energy and if they have a divided stance on that. I think that one of the best politics links nowadays, when there's not an election coming up, is this link about division within Congress. Because Republicans have a majority, but if they are divided, they won't be able to pass many different things. And Trump has so many like negative, disruptive, extremely consequential things on the docket that are coming up that it would be great if those things did not get passed. Um, so that's a pretty, I think that's a decent AF link. Neg, increasing investment in nuclear energy. You could say that it fragments the Democrats. I don't know what the individual people in Congress, I don't know where they stand on nuclear energy. I'm trying to think. You could say like increasing investment in nuclear energy increases like lobbying from fossil fuel corporations, like something, something. Congress goes into a deadlock or they have to like debate about something, as they usually do. And then like our debt ceiling doesn't get passed. Um, I think the debt ceiling arguments are silly. Let me think. I'm thinking about something for the neg though. You could do the same AF link, but it fragments Democrats, which means that Trump gets to pass a bunch of disruptive bad stuff. You could say Trying to think. That's what I can come up with. I don't debate politics that often, and when I do, it is like a copy and pasted DA from the wiki. I don't think I've cut a single politics DA or advantage like on my own. And when I am cutting politics stuff, it's responses to politics because I don't like the arguments. Government contractors. Elaborate on that. I don't know what you mean by this. Michi do terrorists get nukes often? Clearly, I don't know the answer to this question. Um, I assume no, but that could just be cognitive bias. But I don't think they do. Here's the thing. The stuff about terrorists getting nukes, it's very much like a debate argument. It's very much like it's based off of very incredibly specific scenarios. All of the cards about terrorists getting nukes are like if there's an existing conflict and if the conflict has like escalated to a conventional level and like a nuclear power is like involved by proxy. There's so many different boxes that you have to check for a terrorist to get nukes, and there's so many different ways that like major world powers and regulators have to absolutely boof it in order for terrorists to get nukes. And it's just very unlikely that that's going to happen. I've read tons of scenarios about terrorists getting nukes. I can't lie. I said that they would get nukes if Myanmar collapsed. So I'm kind of guilty of that, but I don't think I don't think that they're getting nukes right now. Cameron Ingram said politics DAs are good. I too owed Cameron Ingram, and he collapsed on a politics DA, so not that good. What do you think about the time frame point of no return framing on climate? First, not framing, it would just be weighing that you read. Um, Second, okay, basically since nuclear front loads carbon emissions, yeah, true, true, true. Climate impacts pre point of no return would be purely negative. Oh yeah, that's pretty cool. This is the kind of weighing that you would read on like a turn, I think. And this is less of like time frame weighing. I think that you need to give yourself a bit more credit. This is kind of like short circuit weighing. Basically saying like you could read it on the AF. If you read any kind of climate link on the neg, you could say that it turns the AF and short circuits it because any benefits of climate change will not be reached, but like all of the harms of nuclear happen right now, which means that not only does it's more of a turns case situation. Not only does nuclear like preclude us from reaching positive climate impacts in the future, it actively makes them worse now when it matters, which plunges us into extinction even faster. I think that's great. It's really good turns case weighing. If you are going for like a turn or a climate link on the neg, I think that's pretty compelling. Okay, investments go to government contractors to build nuclear energy. Government contractors are terrible at doing their job. Preach. Overall ineffectiveness takes way too long and too much money. No point of doing the AF advantages. Yeah. I would recommend reading that in rebuttal as like a turn slash overview rather than in constructive, right? Because like government contractors being inefficient has no independent impact, but it like takes out a lot of the AF links, which is good. Um, I'm trying to think of a way that you can make this like independently offensive. You could say maybe you could make something about like private sector. When government tr contractors are involved, they crowd out the private sector, which decreases innovation. And like if you do the comparative, the private sector is way better at doing their job in terms of like nuclear energy investment and stuff like that. So you actively like harm the environment, stuff like that. Yeah, it could be independent offense on the safety argument. You're right. Okay. Any other questions for me? You guys type really long questions, some of you. Is India nuclear independent? Stop asking me things I don't know. Let's actually look at this right now because okay, let me show you guys why I thought India was energy independent. Let's look at it actually. Because I want you to know I'm not like fighting demons right now. Like this was a real argument that we were reading. Guys, you get an exclusive peek into the CCAPF drive right now. Um, did we read Indian quarters? Octas? No, we didn't. Emory? I think it was here. Where's India? Ah, okay. Ignore a lot of the Somaliland specific links. Beijing views Eastern Ladakh through the lens of energy security. So here's where I got confused. China wants India, like wants to take India or like get part of India for their energy security. But I accidentally misremembered this as like India is not energy independent. Like India has no energy security, which is bad. Like this is about China. Like China relies on land-based oil. Like the pipelines need to be outside of the military reach of hostile powers. Blah blah blah. Like India has energy security through pipelines in Ladakh. That's my bad. Apologies to everybody in the Zoom. But yeah, this is where I got it from. This is where I misconstrued that India is energy independent. Thoughts on the dog pipeline? Stop. Can you drop the TOC block file? Thanks. Um, no. I will be disclosing my analytics at King, so feel free. Pre-prep, cases, anything. This isn't good, bro. Like you're losing aura on the outreach Zoom. Are you running real cases at King? Only time will tell. Only time will tell. It's probably in my best interest to do so, right? Because it's a pre-TOC situation. Um, I'm not gonna run tricks. Maybe I'll have a theory round or two. I don't know. I don't like theory that much. Fun fact. Like in terms of things that I like to run, it's substance first, then the K, and then like all the way down like theory. I don't like theory debates that much. Okay. Any other questions for me about the topic analysis? Ah, see, look at this. Long question, long question. How does fiat apply to the US as an actor in general? Ar Arguments about perception of US or trade-off with green energy rely on the US operating in a manner that is consistent with the US that would enact the resolution, but does that necessarily follow from the resolution? Oh, I get what you're saying. Um, I think what you're saying without actually saying it is that like right now the Trump administration is very against doing the AF. Like on a I don't know, on a policy level, right? Um, I think that the AF fiats that you increase investment, and I think that it's difficult. I think that you have to do more analysis on like where that investment is going. Is it to uranium mining? Is it to like the building of new power plants? Like what is most likely? Um, I think that most people are going to interpret it as the building of power plants, but I think actually the somewhat beautiful thing about this resolution versus like others that we've had in the past, I'm thinking like the Rome Statute one, is that Trump is actually largely uninvolved, right? A lot of this is very much like the US federal government does the very first step, but that is fiated, and I don't think you can do a lot of actor analysis about how Trump is going to act in that situation because the resolution says we increase investment. At that point, it's very much in the hands of like, you know, government contractors, private companies, stuff like that, as to what domestic nuclear energy looks like post-AF. So I think that you fiat the initial investment. You have to do slightly more analysis on where that investment is going. Most likely is going to be power plants, and I think that's how a lot of teams are reading arguments. I heard Michi Sin and Justin Wong is breaking Bodhi at King. No, I'll never read Baudrillard. I don't really mess with it. First, I don't think anybody understands Baudrillard. I think that anybody who says that they get it is kind of lying. And I think that a lot of times, like people or teams that read Baudrillard usually read it in response to like structural violence or like soft left arguments. And although I don't know, I just don't really like that like vibe. AF fixes power plant problems, cyber plus waste. Maybe I liked it better when you guys were sending me long questions. I'll parse through this. Af fixes power plant problems. Yeah, I mean that's reasonable. If you find like some kind of card that says that like investment in these areas is likely, yeah, that makes sense. Waste management seems like a likely place investment would go. The thing is, the topic says, oh wait, no, it doesn't say production. I lied. Investment in domestic nuclear energy. Yeah, that could include things like waste and cyber, for sure. You just have to find a card that says that those initiatives are likely. Or even, I think for some judges, like even just uniqueness evidence that those areas are lacking right now, like that cyber is bad right now, that waste management is awful right now, and that it's like actively causing problems, could be enough. And you could do analysis off of that, saying that like because those are the problem areas right now, investment in those places is uniquely likely. I think that some judges would buy that. Some might need more analysis. Okay. Any weight to arguments or responses based on fusion research? No, I like your long questions. This is good. I joke about the long questions, but I appreciate them because it means that you're engaged and that makes me happy. Um, Fusion largely solves for the neg, but probability weighing slash time frame seems to make it rather muddy. Absolutely. And I think, okay, so I think that you can read whatever argument you want, but I'm going to say fusion, common responses to fusion. You run into topicality issues. A lot of teams are probably going to cut cards defining domestic nuclear energy as fission reactions because those are the reactions that we use to produce energy right now. Fusion is something that's more of like research, it's projected for the future. So I think that is like the first main response that you're going to run into, that fusion is non-topical. Another thing is that you may run into things that like fusion's a bad thing. Fusion could be seen by our adversaries as like an escalatory piece of technology, or it could be, I've seen some cards that say that fusion is used in a lot of the tools that the United States uses, is planning to use to like colonize space, right? And there's tons of reasons why like going into space is a bad thing and like emboldens our adversaries and stuff like that. So I think that those are like two arguments you'll run into. The time frame wane is not that bad actually on Fusion. Some sources say that Fusion could be viable by as early as 2026, which if you think about it, by the time TOC rolls around, is in like 8 months. That's pretty good. If it solves like all of the world's woes, absolutely good time frame. I think, and the only situation in which probability in a tech round in which the probability of fusion is going to be asked of you is probably through the lens of topicality. Rather than saying that like fusion as a whole is unlikely, a lot of teams, or at least some of the better teams, will say that like fusion is not the most likely implementation of the resolution because all of our domestic nuclear energy is generated with fission reactions, something that like the United States is good at. The fission reactions is like what goes on in nuclear bombs, stuff like that. So I think that that's the main probability issue you'll run into rather than like teams questioning the actual viability of fusion. They will like go a step further, a step above, and cut you off earlier in that argument. What is fusion? Why is fusion non-topical? Isn't it still domestic nuclear energy? Yeah, for sure. You could make that argument absolutely. A lot of teams will probably just say that like our current domestic nuclear energy is produced using fission reactions, and that fusion is like I don't know. There's a ton of different ways that you could spin it. That's how I mainly view the fusion situation, but you could also go like a step down and just turn it and say that fusion's bad. But I don't know. The fusion arguments have a good amount of potential. I would not recommend reading it on a lay judge. I think that lay judges don't take well to, even if fusion is a good argument, lay judges don't take well to any kind of debate about like what the resolution specifically says, specific wording or like definitions or like anything drifting into the topicality territory. And I just don't think that's a gamble that you want to take on a lay judge. But like, feel free to read on like a more tech judge. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I will assume there are no more questions, but if any of you have any questions, just feel free to ping me in the Discord. That was like a low-key nerdy sentence, but I'm the one in like general who sent the like slides link, so you can just feel free to respond to that. That way I know if you like have a question or want to reach out about the topic or anything like that.